there was a farmer who had a pocket watch. His pocket watch had a lot of sentimental value to him. I have a pocket watch just like that. When my dad graduated from seminary, my grandmother, his mother, gave him a pocket watch, and when I graduated from seminary, he gave that pocket watch to me, and I would be quite distressed if I ever lost it or something ever happened to it. Well, wouldn't you know, the farmer, one day as he was stacking hay inside the barn, he had that pocket watch on him, and somehow through the work, he lost it. He began to search high and low all throughout the barn, all throughout the hay. He searched and he searched and he searched and he couldn't find it. He was so distraught, in fact, that he set out a community alert that if anybody would come to his barn and find his pocket watch, that he would give them a reward. Well, when we hear about a reward and finding a pocket watch, we all rush there to see if we can get the reward. And people from all over the community came, and no one was able to find it. And there was this little boy, after all the hustle and bustle, all the commotion, there was this little boy that walked up to the farmer, and he said, "Can I have a try?" And the farmer said, "Well, everybody else has tried and couldn't find it. What's this going to hurt for this little guy to give it a shot?" And so he let the little boy go in and shut the barn doors. The little boy was in there by himself, and a few minutes later, the little boy walked out, and he had this pocket watch in his hand. The farmer was elated. He had his pocket watch, this treasure that he had lost, and now it was found. He said, "How did you, all of these people came, and you were in there for just a few minutes. How did you find it?" He said, he said, "I just went to the middle of the barn, I sat down, and it was quiet. And then I heard the ticking noise of the watch. I sat down in the silence, and in the silence, I heard the sound of the watch, and I walked over and got it." Silence can be, at our house, it's never silent, ever. Even at night, we have fans on, because we're just so used to noise, lots of noise. You have to have it to sleep. Silence can be pretty eerie, but it can also be pretty useful. As we come to our text today, we come to Genesis chapter 38, and I wonder if there's anyone in here this morning, anybody that's been here for a few weeks, you know that we preach through the Bible, we go verse by verse, chapter by chapter, and I wonder if there's anybody that read ahead this week. That's okay. That's cool. Well, I was wondering if there was anybody that read ahead to chapter 38, and if you did, you probably began to wonder how this was going to work on a Sunday morning. Chapter 38 is a pretty tough text. It's pretty difficult to deal with, and some of you are reading ahead, and you've already got to verses 6 and 7, and you said, "Whoa." We come to chapter 38, and I want to give you a warning. As far as I can see, all the kiddos are downstairs. We're going to talk about some things this morning, and parents, just beware. You may have to answer some difficult questions at lunch. You've been warned. We come to chapter 38 after finishing chapter 37 when Jacob sends his son Joseph. Now, if you don't know Joseph, Joseph is Jacob's son. Jacob had 12 sons. Joseph was one of the younger ones. He would have a younger son later, but Joseph was his father's favorite son. He was his favorite son. We know this because he gave him a position in the family. He was over all the other brothers, and he made him this coat. Now, if you've been here for several weeks, you know that this coat literally means long sleeves, right? It was a coat of many colors. It was kind of like a three-piece suit, right? So all of the brothers are shepherds, and so they're all out wearing Wranglers and Carhartts, and we have Joseph, the younger brother. Dad gives him a three-piece suit, and he says, "You go make sure all those guys are doing what they're supposed to be doing." So you get the picture. Joseph is the favorite. Well, all of that happens. Joseph has a couple of dreams that God reveals to Joseph and to the family that Joseph at some point in time is going to have the rest of the family bow down to him in honor and reverence. Now, obviously, they hate all this. Right? I've got a younger brother, and if I knew that I would one day bow down to my younger brother as a kid, I wouldn't have liked that. And I could beat him up all the way to the point where he became a police officer and could bench like 300 pounds, and then one day after he threw me across the room, all of that nonsense ended. Well, the brothers hate Joseph. They hate him so much that they can't even say one good word to him. And so one day, his father, Jacob, sends his son Joseph out to make sure that the boys are doing what they're supposed to be doing, watching the sheep, doing all those things. And as they see him coming, they come up with a plan. They come up with a plan to get rid of Joseph. They said, hey, we're just going to kill him. One of the older brothers speaks up and he says, let's not do that. That may be going a little bit too far. Let's just throw him into this pit. And so they threw him into the pit, but after that, they saw these businessmen going by and says, hey, why waste an opportunity to make a little bit of money? Let's just sell Joseph into slavery. We'll take his coat that Dad gave him. We'll shred it up. We'll dip it into some goat's blood. We'll take it back to Dad. Dad will think an animal got him on his journey out here, and we'll be done with Joseph, and we'll be able to live our lives exactly how we want to live them. And so that's what they do. We left off in chapter 37. We learn in verse 36, meanwhile, the Midianites, those were the businessmen who bought Joseph, sold him into Egypt to Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, the captain of the guard. Now we come to chapter 38. Now I'll just go ahead and tell you, chapter 38 does not mention Joseph any. And it's a little bit strange. We think that chapter 38 doesn't have anything to do with Joseph. It certainly doesn't mention him, but it plays a bigger role into the whole storyline that's going to carry us all the way throughout Genesis chapter 50. So we come to this text, and there are a couple of reasons why I think that it's in here. First of all, I think this passage heightens the tensions of the readers for the story of Joseph. Joseph's story begins in verse 37, and we're going to follow it all the way out through chapter 50 to see what happens in Joseph's life. And I believe chapter 38 heightens the tensions that we're going to see what happens to Joseph. It's kind of like a commercial break, right? You're watching a Netflix series and you have some commercial breaks, or you pan back and say, okay, meanwhile, back at home, right, we see what Judah is up to. Secondly, I think this story gives us a backdrop against which we can measure the character of Joseph. Next week, when we get to chapter 39, we're going to be able to look back on chapter 38, and we're going to be able to see, okay, one thing is not like the other. Joseph is not like Judah, and Judah is not like Joseph. Thirdly, I think this passage does something else. I think it reveals to us the character of the man who would later become the leader of all the brothers. Derek Kidner, who wrote a commentary on Genesis, put it like this. He said, as a rude interruption of the story of Joseph, this passage serves other purposes as well. It creates suspense for the reader with Joseph's future in the balance. It puts his faith and his chastity, soon to be described, in context, which sets off their rarity, and it fills out the portrait of the effective leader among the other 10 brothers. And so for all these reasons and more, it's apparent that this is not a wandering or a random chapter in the midst of the Bible that we should just skip over, but Moses has an agenda for writing chapter 38. He has a purpose for telling us this story in the midst of Joseph's life. So as we come to this text today, into Genesis chapter 38, I think God always reveals His purposes for recording these kinds of events. And I think that we're going to recognize some of those today. But as I was studying this text and getting ready for the sermon this morning, there was one thing that was eerily clear. And after you get through the first few verses, God is silent. God's silent. Now you look into Joseph's life, you can see God giving Joseph dreams. You can see God working out things in his life that lead him to the place that he needs to be. But when we read Genesis 38, God's pretty silent. The silence can be a little bit eerie. But that silence can also be pretty useful. So what I want us to do today is I want to look at the question, what do we do when God is silent? What do we do when God is silent? Here's the first thing that we see. When God is silent, we take matters into our own hands. When God is silent, we take matters into our own hands. This story begins in Genesis chapter 38, verse 1. It happened at that time that Judah went down from his brothers and turned aside to a certain Adulamite whose name was Hira. There Judah saw the daughter of a certain Canaanite whose name was Shua. He took her and went into her, and she conceived and bore a son, and called his name Let's go to the Lord in prayer. Father, as we come to this difficult chapter in your word today, Lord, while it is difficult, it is absolutely useful and purposeful for our life as followers of Christ. Lord, we need to know what's going on in this chapter. God, we need to know how you work in the midst of silence. We need to know what happens when we take matters into our own hands. We need to know what to do when we are to wait on your hand. And so, Father, we pray as we go through this text, Lord, that you would transform our hearts by the renewing of our minds through your holy word. In Jesus' name, amen. When God is silent, we take matters into our own hands. So we're introduced to Judah. Judah has come up in chapter 37. Judah is one of the older brothers. Judah goes down from his brothers and he turns aside to a certain Adulamite. Now that was a description of the family. They were Canaanites. The Bible doesn't even give his wife's name, but we know that Judah has gone down and he finds a Canaanite woman. Now, if you read the rest of Scripture, you know that it's never a good idea to have a Canaanite wife. But for whatever reason, Judah goes down and he finds a Canaanite woman. He marries her and he has 3 sons, Onan, and Shelah. Now, Judah is married. He's got 3 boys. And now we're about to learn what happens with the 3 boys. Finds a wife named Tamar. The Bible tells us that is so wicked that God kills him. Now, I'm not sure how wicked you have to be where God just decides that you need to die, but whatever that point is, that's where was in his life. He marries a woman. Right, so Judah takes his wife's firstborn, and he had his wife was named Tamar. We'll see her come up. He was so wicked in the sight of the Lord put him to death. So, what happens after is put to death? Well, the natural thing, the legal thing in this culture was for the younger son to take his wife to provide a son and heir for the older son who had died. Now, this is where if things aren't sketchy to begin with, they get a little bit more difficult. Onan has the task, y'all can't giggle while I'm doing this, Onan has the task of taking his older brother's wife to provide a son for him, to carry on his name, and this son would get the inheritance. Onan knows this. Onan says, hey, if I provide an heir for my older brother who's now dead, he gets the inheritance. But if I just pretend, if I go through the motions, then the inheritance will go to me. This is called levirate marriage. It was a cultural distinction in the day, and if you just need to know this, it's not cool anymore. Okay? We don't do those things anymore. Right? That was back in this day. We don't do that anymore. So here's where Onan comes into the picture. He's going to provide an heir for his son. And I'll just put it like this. Onan goes through the motions. Onan goes through the motions of providing an heir for his older brother, but he doesn't bring it home. God looks at him and he decides that this is also a wicked and evil thing. And Onan's life is taken as well. Well, we got 2 older brothers who are both dead now, and we have 1 wife, right? So Judah looks at this picture and he says, okay, both of them have dealt with this woman. Now both of them are dead, right? 2 plus 2 equals 4. So Judah puts all of these things together and he says, hey, it may not be a good idea for me to give my younger son to her to be the next husband. And so this is what Judah tells Tamar. He says, look, you go back to your father, you go back as a widow, and when Shelah, who is the youngest son, is of age, I'll give him to you, and you can be married, and he'll provide an heir for my family's name. So that's where we stand. All of these things have happened. In verse 11, then Judah said to Tamar, his daughter-in-law, remain a widow in your father's house till Shelah, my son, grows up, for he feared that he would die like his brothers. So Tamar went and remained in her father's house. So we got two dead brothers, both were wicked. Judah decides that he doesn't want to see his youngest son die as well. And so he sends this woman back to her father's house. Now here's what you need to know about that. He commanded her to be a widow, which meant that she couldn't just go home and marry somebody else. She had to remain a widow. It would have been unclean, it would have been unright for her to have another husband. And this will come back into play a little bit later on in the story. But here's what I want you to know. God's at work in this family. God's at work in this family. And you may be sitting there thinking, Nathan, I'm not so sure that I want God to work in my life the way God is working in this family's life, and I don't know that I can blame you. God's work is in this family. God's at work in this family. What we see in verses 1 through 11 in this story is that this is a family who needs a whole lot of grace. God's at work in this family. He's at work in the family of Jacob, but they are an absolute mess. And in the midst of their mess, we see their great need for grace. We also see what grace has made of Joseph. We look into Joseph's life. You look at his family, and you wonder exactly where Joseph came from. We're going to compare this chapter next week with chapter 39 and the life of Joseph and his character. We're going to see one of these things is not like the other. And certainly Joseph is different from the rest of his family. Joseph's life is a result of grace. We also see God's hand of providence in the life of this family. So when God is silent, we take matters into our own hands. And when God is silent, things get a little messy. As we go on from verse 11 and into verse 12 through verse 26, we see the story progress. So in the course of time, the wife of Judah, Shua's daughter, died. When Judah was comforted, he went up to Timnah to his sheep shearers, he and his friend Hira the Adulamite. So this is what's happened. We leave off verse 11. The older son, is now dead. He's really wicked. God killed him. Onan does a wicked act. God also kills him. Judah tells Tamar, the wife, that Shelah, the youngest son, is not old enough yet. When he is old enough, I'll come find you. It becomes very clear that Judah is never going to go find Tamar. He's going to leave her to be a widow with her father for the rest of her life. And so this is what happens next. Judah and one of his friends, they are going to an event that's kind of like the Mardi Gras of sheep shearing. So what they would do is when it got time to shear the sheep, now this was a particular time in the year, everybody would get together and they would go and shear the sheep together, and really what it worked out to be was a huge party where they worked a little bit. And so they would get together, and you have to understand, these are Canaanite people. They're wicked. They have false gods and idols. And so they would get together, they would work, they would party all night long. They would prostitute themselves out. They would do all of these wicked things while they were shearing sheep. Judah knew this, and Judah was looking for a little bit of comfort in the midst of his wife's passing. So Moses, in writing Genesis 38, shows us the backdrop, the culture, the context of what Judah is doing. So we look at this and we understand that Judah is just looking for a little bit of relief, but what he finds is a whole lot of messiness. So what happens is Judah's going to this place. He's shearing sheep, he's partying, catching beads, whatever. Tamar gets an idea in her mind that she's going to take the matters of her family into her own hands. And so she goes to the city, right? She goes to Timnah. She puts on the traditional garments of a prostitute, and she waits. She sees Judah and the whole company coming. It's really clear that Judah is not looking for Tamar to give her his youngest son. And so she comes up with this plan. Judah comes up to her for her services. And after that, Tamar says, give me a sign that I'll know that you're going to come back and give me my payment for my services. And so Judah gives her three things: a signet, a cord, and a staff. Now what would happen was they came to the place where a goat was the price. I don't know why. That's just what the Bible says. So what was going to happen? Judah was going to go back and he was going to get a goat. He would bring it back to this lady who he did not know yet. He would get his stuff back in place of this goat for her services. Referring back to David Kidner, he says, such was the world in which Judah had married. The prophets report its corrupting power over Israel for generations to come. And so does a wicked thing in Israel. In the midst of his own bereavement and the loss of his own life, he engages in an adulterous contact with a woman he does not know. He makes a commitment to this lady that he still doesn't know. Judah has been sucked into this Canaanite culture, the Canaanite system, the practices of the Canaanites, and he's been sucked into precisely because of the fact that he's married into it. This is Judah's own choice. So when God is silent, things get a little messy. Growing up, I've told you this before, but my dad loved the Andy Griffith Show. There was one episode of the Andy Griffith Show that I really loved. It was the episode where Andy was convinced to be the umpire for the county baseball game. Now, for those of you who are familiar with the Andy Griffith Show, you know that you got Mayberry, and then a few miles down the road you got Mount Pilot. So Mayberry and Mount Pilot were going to go at it. The umpire who was supposed to umpire that game got sick, and everybody convinced Andy, against his own wishes, to umpire the game. Well, the only problem with this was Opie was on Mayberry's baseball team. Andy could see some conflict coming, so he set himself out to not be biased, but to call the game as he saw it. And so the game proceeds, and there's 2 outs, and guess who comes to bat? Opie Taylor. Opie gets up there, Andy calls a couple of strikes, and then Opie pounds one to center field, and he's running around the bases. If he scores, the game is tied, and they'll go into extra innings. Opie comes around the bases running as hard as he can, and as he gets to the plate, the ball gets to the catcher, he slides, and Andy calls him out. Well, you know what happened. Mount Pilot went crazy, and so did Mayberry. And it wasn't only the baseball team that went crazy on Andy. It was the whole town. Goober and the rest of the gang got really mad and angry at Andy because he called Opie out. How can he do such a thing? And Andy kept saying over and over again, I just called it as I saw it. Well, as you know, in the sitcoms of those days, everything was worked out in a few minutes and everybody was hugging and happy at the end of it. But Andy's girlfriend, Helen, was at the game that day taking pictures. She was taking pictures. In the last scene of the episode, Aunt Bee and Helen were on the couch looking at these pictures. They were looking at Andy and Opie, looking at pictures of the game. And then they came to the last picture. Helen unknowingly caught the play at the plate in a picture. And Opie was saved by a mile. What does she do? She takes the picture, she tears it up, and they promise never to tell what happened. You see, what Helen had was a perspective that nobody else had. Andy had convinced himself and everybody else in Mayberry that he had the perfect vantage point to make that right call. But he didn't have the best perspective. Another commentator on this text says this: Judah shows a remarkable ability to bring the heart of the matter clearly into view and thereby to enable his present circumstances to be seen from a new perspective. Because here's what happens. After Judah does what he does in Timnah, all he knows is that he slept with a prostitute. He sends a hired hand to go take the payment of a goat to this lady who nobody can find. But when he gets back, Judah hears a story. He realizes that his daughter-in-law has been unfaithful to the commitment that she's made, and she's pregnant. When Judah gets really angry, Judah gets so angry, in fact, and he tells his men, you go get her, bring her out here, and we're going to burn her. When God's silent, things get a little bit messy. And so they made this commitment to get Tamar, bring her back to their home, and he's going to burn her for what she's done. Before they're able to do this, Tamar says, take this staff and this cord and this signet, and who these belong to is the father of this child. Uh-oh. Well, who's the father? It's Judah. Judah comes out and he realizes what he's done. He realizes that he's caught and there's no way out of this. And he says this in verse 26. She is more righteous than I, since I didn't give her to my son, Shelah. And he did not know her again. Judah now has a better perspective on who he is and what he's done. Now he says, she's more righteous than I. Now I want you to understand that God nor the Bible is affirming what Tamar did. Because for Judah to say that she's more righteous than I am is not saying a whole lot. But he realizes what he's done. You see, when God is silent, things get a little bit messy. But how does a new perspective help us in the messiness, especially when God is silent? How do you view your life today? Are you looking at your life from the perspective of the messiness, of the difficulties, of maybe some of the consequences from past mistakes that you're still paying for today? In the midst of destruction, Jeremiah looked around and determined this in Lamentations chapter 3. The steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. His mercies never come to an end. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. See, Jeremiah was sitting in the midst of a city that God destroyed. And he came to the conclusion that God's mercies are new every day. Great is his faithfulness. When God is silent, we take matters into our own hands, then things get really messy. But when God is silent, it does not mean that God is not working. Things are really messy for Judah and Tamar. I don't have to go back through this story to build the case for you that family is a little bit dysfunctional. If nothing else today, you should feel a whole lot better about your family. Maybe not. This messy, and this dysfunctional, and this tough. But looking through all of this, Judah vows never to know her again. And so we've got Tamar that's pregnant. Verse 27, when the time of her labor came, there were twins in her womb. And when she was in labor, one put out a hand, and the midwife took and tied a scarlet thread on his hand, saying, this one came out first. But as he drew back his hand, behold, his brother came out. He said, what a breach you've made for yourself. Therefore his name was called Perez. Afterward his brother came out with the scarlet thread on his hand, and his name was called Zerah. Things are messy for Judah and Tamar. God's been silent, and now Tamar gives birth to twins. In the midst of all of this chapter, we've read some really difficult things. We've read some things that, quite honestly, make us feel a little bit uncomfortable. God's been silent through the whole thing, but in the end of the chapter, we see this silence is broken with a cry of a baby. You've been here for some time. You were here, no doubt, when we preached through the book of Malachi. Malachi, you want to talk about messiness. The people of Israel, when Malachi was the prophet there, was a complete disaster. God starts off the book of Malachi like this. He makes this triumphant claim, oh, how I have loved you. And how did the people respond? How in the world have you loved us? It gets so bad through the book of Malachi, in fact, that God at one point says, I wish somebody would go lock the doors of the temple so you couldn't even pretend to love me. Pretty messy. At the end of the book of Malachi, God says his piece. He says what he wants them to know through Malachi, and then there are 400 years of silence. God says what he wants them to know, and then is silent for 400 years. There was a time in my life when God was silent. In the most difficult parts of my life, when I found myself alone, living in a buddy's house in a glorified closet with an army cot and a duffel bag full of clothes. When God kept putting men into my life who would not let me go any further. And so I finally got to the point where I said, okay, God, I'll bite. If you've got anything left for me, here I am. And this is what God said. Nathan, if you want me, prove it. Now, when I heard that growing up as a pastor's kid, I didn't know God was supposed to say things like that. I thought he was just supposed to make it all better and it would be sunshine and rainbows for the rest of my life. But that's not what God did. God told me that he was going to let me live in silence for a little while. And so for the next few months, I sat out on seeking God in a way that I've never sought after him before. Every day, and I was building houses at the time, and I would go and I would work, I would wake up, I would read God's Word, I would fast, I would pray, I would go to work, I'd come home, I'd go to that glorified closet that they called a room, and I would pray some more, and fast some more, and read some more, and I would seek God some more. And I did this for a few months on end. And then God broke the silence. He said, Nathan, I've always loved you. I've never not loved you. He said, I called you to preach, and when I'm done with you, I'll let you know. And so through one of the most difficult time of my life, God was silent, but it was in that silence that I found him. You may be wondering what happened after 400 years of silence after God spoke to the Israelites. God said his peace at the end of Malachi, and there were 400 years of silence. And then that silence was broken with the cry of a baby. Amen. When God sent his only son, Jesus, as a response to his silence. God's silence is how it feels, not how it is. You may think that God is done with you. It may feel like you're living in the silence, but it doesn't mean that God isn't working. We consider the silence of God and the messiness of Judah and Tamar's life, and then we read Matthew chapter 1, verse 3. You may not think that anything really exciting can ever come out of a genealogy, but Matthew chapter 1, verses 1 through 18 is the genealogy of the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. And included in Matthew chapter 1, verse 3 is Judah, Tamar, Perez, and Zerah. Just because God is silent doesn't mean that God isn't working. Andrew Peterson's song, The Silence of God, he says it's enough to drive a man crazy. It'll break a man's faith. It's enough to make him wonder if he's ever been sane. When he's bleeding for comfort from thy staff and thy rod, and the heaven's only answer is the silence of God. There's another song called Hard to Get. It says, do you remember when you lived down here where we all scrape to find the faith to ask for daily bread? Did you forget about us when you had flown away? Well, I memorized every word you said. Still, I'm so scared I'm holding my breath while you're up there just playing hard to get. It was Job in Job chapter 30, verse 20 that said, I cry to you for help and you do not answer me. I stand and you only look at me. David, in the midst of his sin, in Psalm 22 said, my God, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from saving me from the words of my groaning? Oh my God, I cry by day, but you do not answer, and by night, but I find no rest. Is that where you are today? Are you living in the midst of God's silence and you feel like God is done with you? I want you to consider a few of these questions. What is it that absence makes the heart grow fonder, but familiarity breeds contempt? Why is water so much more refreshing when we're really, really thirsty? Why am I almost never satisfied with what I have, but always longing for more? Why can the thought of being denied a desire for marriage or children or freedom or some other dream create in us a desperation we previously didn't have? Why is the pursuit of earthly achievement often more enjoyable than the achievement itself? Why do deprivation, adversity, scarcity, and suffering often produce the best character qualities in us, while prosperity, ease, and abundance often produce the worst? John Bloom would say, if desire is to earth what sight is to heaven, then God answers our prayer with more desire. You see, it's the desert that awakens and sustains this desire. It's the desert that dries up our infatuation with worldliness, and it's the desert that draws us to the well of the world to come. You're in that place of longing to break the silence. Maybe you feel like you're in a desert. Maybe you feel like you hadn't heard God in a long time, even if He's even there anymore. And I have two things for you. Number one, desire Him in the silence. Matthew chapter 5, verse 6 says, "Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be filled." Desire Him in the silence. Number two, seek Him in the silence. Luke chapter 11, Jesus said, "And I tell you, ask, and it will be given to you. Seek, and you will find. Knock, and it will be open to you. For everyone who asks receives, and the one who seeks finds, and to the one who knocks it will be opened." Desire Him in the silence, and seek Him in the silence. Let's pray.